In this video, we're going to look at a solution to the classic SQL interview question, visits without purchases. So let's jump in. So in this question, we're given two tables. The first table is the store visits table. So this table has two columns. The first is the visit ID, which is the primary key and an integer. And the second is the customer ID, which is also an integer. The next table is the purchases table. So this has three columns. The first is the purchase ID, which is the primary key and an integer. The second is the visit ID, which is a foreign key and references the visit ID from the store's visits table. And then lastly, we have the purchase amount, which is an integer. And so our job is to write a solution to find the customer IDs of customers who visited the store without making any purchases and the number of times they made such visits. So we need to return the customer ID and the number of visits they made to the store where they did not make a purchase, and then we can return the table sorted in any order. So as always, I think the best way to understand it is to walk through an example. So in this example, we have our store visits table that has the visit ID and customer ID, as well as the purchases table, which has our purchase ID, visit ID, and purchase amount. So let's look at the store visits table. So as you can see, we've got customer ID 101 here in the first row. And as you can see, that is the only time customer 101 made a visit. Now look at their visit ID, which is visit ID of 1. And as you can see in the purchases table here, we have a visit ID and an associated purchase. So we know that for customer 101, they made one visit and they made a purchase on that visit. So therefore, we will not include them in the output because the only visit they made a purchase. So therefore, there's no times they made a visit without having a purchase. So now looking at customer 102, again, they only made one visit, and then this visit had a visit ID of 2. And as we can see, they also made on that one visit a purchase with an amount of 250. So again, we will not include them in our output table. Next, we have a customer with ID 103. And as you can see, they have a visit ID of 3. And so if we go down to our purchase table, there is no visit ID of 3. And so in our output, we can now say we have customer ID 103, and they made one visit where they made no purchase. Next, we've got customer 104, and as you can see, they made several visits. So they made a visit with visit ID of 4, they made a visit with visit ID of 6 and 7 as well. So if we go down to our purchases table, we can see there's visit IDs of 4 and 6. And again, in visit ID of 4, there were 2 purchases made, and visit ID of 6, there's 1 purchase made. However, customer 104 also had a visit ID of 7 that does not appear in the purchases table, and so therefore we can include 104 in our output with one visit where no purchases were made. And then looking at customer with ID of 105, they had one visit with a visit ID of 5. Again, 5 does not appear in the purchases table, so we will include them in our output. And then finally 106 as well had a visit ID of 8. 8 does not appear in the purchases table, so we'll also include that in the output. So the key thing here is being able to keep track of the number of visits of each customer, and then how many times within those visits were no purchases made, and then to store that in our output table. So hopefully that makes sense, but now let's jump into the code to make it crystal clear. So in the first line, we're using select to retrieve the customer ID from the store visits table, which we're aliasing with v, and we'll see that in a second. Then we're also using count. So count aggregates the number of visits, in this case without purchases for each customer. And then we're going to alias this as visits number of purchases for our output table. Then we're going to use from to select from the store visits table, and then we're using v to alias that name. So it's going to be v will reference the store visits table. Then we're using the left join. So this will include rows that are in store visits that do not necessarily have to be in the purchases table. And again, we're using p here to alias the purchases table, and then we're using on, so the visit ID in store visits equals the visit ID in the purchases table. Then we'll use the where clause to filter for visits with no associated purchases, and we can identify this as the purchase ID is null. And then finally, we will use group by, so this will group results by customer ID to count non-purchase visits. So hopefully this makes sense. I think the hardest thing in this question to get your head around is the left join. So to better understand left join, let's look at this simple sample SQL code. So we're saying select column names from table 1, left join on table 2, on table 1 column name equals table 2 column name. And so here essentially what we're doing is we're keeping all the rows in table 1 where the column name equals the column name in table 2. But if it doesn't exist in table 2, we will simply have null because we are keeping all the rows from table 1. And so I think this is a nice visual. And so bringing it into our question, we are keeping all the rows on store visits, even if the visit ID does not exist in the purchases table. So the key thing about left join is that which rows survive? Well, every row from the left hand table, which in our case will be the store visits table. What happens to rows without a match? Well, they are kept with nulls for right side columns. And then the typical use case is for keeping a full list with optional details. So hopefully that kind of clears up how the left join works. So let's run the code now and see if the tests pass. Perfect, the test passed. Let's run the test suite and see if all the tests pass. Perfect, all the tests pass. If you want to try it out for yourself, the link to the question is in the description. And if you got any value out of it, please like and subscribe and share it with a friend. It helps the channel out a lot. And hopefully I will see you in the next one.